There's something quietly unsettling about the idea that the ancient world may have understood more than we assume. Not in a mystical or exaggerated sense, but in ways that don't quite fit the timeline we've built for human progress. As if knowledge didn't simply grow in a straight line from primitive to advanced, but instead appeared, disappeared, and perhaps reappeared again in fragments, scattered across civilizations that never fully explained how they knew what they knew. Before we go further, take a moment to settle in, wherever you are listening from tonight, whether it's late evening, early morning, or somewhere in between. And if you enjoy exploring ideas like this, calmly, carefully, without jumping to conclusions, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It's always interesting to see how far these conversations travel, across different places, different perspectives, all connecting through the same quiet curiosity. Because tonight, we're not here to claim that ancient civilizations had advanced technology hidden away, or that they possessed some lost supernatural power. Instead, we're going to do something much more grounded and, in a way, more interesting. We're going to look at what we actually know, what has been measured, documented, and studied, and then gently examine the places where the explanations feel incomplete, not wrong, but perhaps not fully finished. The mainstream understanding of ancient knowledge is relatively straightforward. Early humans observed the world around them. They tracked the movement of the sun, the moon, and the stars. They experimented through trial and error, and over thousands of years, they slowly built systems, mathematics, architecture, medicine, astronomy, that became more refined with time. Knowledge, in this view, is cumulative, each generation adding a little more than the last, a steady climb from simplicity toward complexity. And in many ways, this model works. We can trace the development of writing systems from simple symbols to structured language. We can see how early counting methods evolved into sophisticated mathematics. We can follow architectural techniques improving from basic shelters to monumental structures. There is a clear progression, a pattern of learning, refining, and advancing. But then, there are moments where that progression doesn't feel entirely smooth. Moments where something appears, not necessarily out of nowhere, but perhaps slightly ahead of where we would expect it to be. Take ancient astronomy, for example. Civilizations like those in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and later Mesoamerica developed extremely precise systems for tracking celestial movements. The mainstream explanation is that these were the result of long-term observation. Generations watching the sky, recording patterns, refining predictions, and over time, achieving remarkable accuracy. And that makes sense. If you watch something long enough, you begin to notice patterns. Cycles repeat, anomalies stand out, and eventually, you can predict what comes next. But here's where it gets interesting. Some of these systems reached levels of precision that would require not just observation, but consistency over very long periods of time, sometimes longer than we can clearly account for in the archaeological record, suggesting either that the observations were far more continuous than we realize, or that knowledge was preserved and transmitted with a level of accuracy that is, frankly, difficult to maintain without interruption. And this raises a quiet question. Not a dramatic one, not a conspiratorial leap, just a simple observation. How stable were these knowledge systems really? Because when we look at history, we see something else happening alongside progress. We see collapse, civilizations rising and falling, knowledge being lost, rediscovered, rewritten, libraries destroyed, languages forgotten, entire systems of understanding disappearing for centuries before re-emerging in altered forms. So if knowledge is supposed to move steadily forward, Why do we keep seeing these resets? And more importantly, what happens to knowledge during those resets? Does it vanish completely? Or does it survive in fragments, encoded in traditions, myths, architectural practices, or symbolic systems that later generations inherit without fully understanding their original context? For example, consider ancient construction techniques. Massive stone structures built with a precision that still raises questions today, not because they are impossible, but because the methods used are not always fully documented. The mainstream explanation points to skilled labor, simple tools used with remarkable expertise, and a deep understanding of materials. And again, that explanation holds weight. There's no need to assume anything beyond human capability. But even within that explanation, there are gaps, not contradictions, but areas where the details are still debated. How certain stones were transported over long distances, how they were shaped with such consistency, how alignments were achieved with limited measuring tools. These are active areas of research, not mysteries in the sense of being unsolvable, but questions that remain open. And this is where a more thoughtful kind of speculation begins. Not asking, was it aliens, or was it lost technology, but something much more grounded. Could it be that ancient knowledge systems were more sophisticated in specific areas than we tend to assume? Not across the board, not universally advanced, but highly refined in certain domains due to focused attention over long periods. In other words, instead of imagining the past as generally primitive with occasional unexplained anomalies, what if it was unevenly advanced? Certain fields pushed further than others. Certain skills developed to extraordinary levels, while others remained basic. This would explain why we see incredible precision in some areas, alongside relatively simple approaches in others. Not because something doesn't fit, but because development wasn't uniform. And then there's the question of transmission, how knowledge moves from one generation to the next. Today, we rely heavily on written records, digital storage, standardized education. But in ancient times, much of knowledge was passed down orally, through apprenticeship, through direct instruction, through repetition and memory. And while this method can be incredibly effective, it is also fragile. A disruption, a war, a migration, a natural disaster can break the chain. And once that chain is broken, rebuilding it is not always straightforward. So when we find ancient knowledge that seems unusually refined, we have to ask, how long was it being developed before it was recorded? And how much of it might have been lost before we ever had a chance to see it? Because what we have today may not be the full picture. It may be what survived. And survival, by its nature, is selective. Certain ideas endure because they are practical, others because they are culturally significant, and some simply by chance, preserved in a text, carved in stone, embedded in a structure that outlasted everything around it. Which means that when we look back, we are not seeing the entire system of ancient knowledge. We are seeing the pieces that made it through. And that can create a subtle illusion, where those pieces appear more mysterious than they might have been in their original context. Not because they were inherently beyond understanding, but because the surrounding framework, the explanations, the incremental steps, the trial and error has faded away, leaving us with results, but not always the process. And this is where careful thinking becomes important, because it's very easy to fill those gaps with assumptions, to jump from, we don't fully know how this was done, to, it must have been something extraordinary. But there is a quieter, more grounded approach, to simply acknowledge the gap, to sit with it, and to explore possible explanations without rushing to finalize them. Because sometimes the most interesting place to be is not at the conclusion, but in the question itself. What did ancient people actually know? Not in exaggerated terms, but in measurable, observable ways. How did they acquire that knowledge? How did they preserve it? And perhaps most importantly, how much of it have we misunderstood? Not because it was beyond us, but because we are interpreting it through a completely different framework. And as we move forward, part by part, we're going to continue exploring these ideas. Slowly, carefully, looking at specific examples, patterns that repeat across different cultures, places where the mainstream explanation is strong, and places where it leaves just enough room for curiosity to remain. Not to replace one certainty with another, but to better understand the space in between. As we move a little deeper into this idea, it helps to slow down and focus on something very specific, because the broader question of ancient knowledge can feel abstract until we anchor it in real examples. And one of the most grounded places to begin is with something that every early civilization depended on, something practical, measurable, and essential to survival: the ability to measure time. Timekeeping is often presented as one of humanity's simplest early achievements. People noticed the cycle of day and night, the changing seasons, the phases of the moon. And from these observations, they created calendars, systems that allowed them to predict when to plant crops, when to harvest, when rivers might flood. The mainstream explanation is clear and logical. Timekeeping developed gradually through observation and necessity. And again, that explanation works. It fits what we would expect. If you observe the sky over many years, you begin to notice patterns. The sun rises and sets in predictable ways. The moon cycles through phases. The stars shift slowly across the horizon. And with enough patience, those patterns can be organized into a system. But as we look closer, something begins to stand out. Not a contradiction, but a level of precision that feels surprisingly refined. Ancient civilizations didn't just create rough calendars. Many of them developed systems that tracked time with remarkable accuracy, aligning solar years, lunar cycles, and even longer astronomical patterns with a consistency that suggests not just observation, but careful correction, adjustment over time, an awareness that cycles are not perfectly aligned and that systems need to be recalibrated. Take, for example, the way some ancient cultures accounted for the difference between lunar months and the solar year. A lunar cycle is about 29.5 days. 12 of those cycles fall short of a full solar year. So if you base your calendar purely on the moon, your seasons begin to drift, slowly at first, but noticeably over time. And yet, several ancient systems developed methods to correct this drift, adding extra months at specific intervals, creating what we now call lunisolar calendars. Systems that keep both the moon and the seasons in alignment. The mainstream explanation is that this was discovered through long-term observation, noticing the drift, adjusting for it, refining the system generation by generation. And that makes sense, but it also implies something important: continuity. Because to notice a slow drift, you need consistent records. You need people paying attention not just for a few years, but across decades, possibly centuries. You need a system where observations are preserved, compared, and updated. And this is where the question becomes more interesting. Not, could they figure this out? But how stable were the systems that allowed them to keep track of it? Because maintaining that level of precision over long periods requires more than just intelligence. It requires structure, reliable transmission, a way of ensuring that knowledge doesn't degrade as it's passed on. And when we consider how often ancient societies experience disruption, conflict, environmental changes, migration. It raises a subtle point. How did these timekeeping systems remain so consistent despite those interruptions? One possible answer is that they didn't remain perfectly consistent, that what we are seeing are the versions that survived, the ones that were refined enough or important enough to be maintained and preserved, while other systems may have been lost entirely. But there's another layer to this, something quieter. When we look at ancient monuments, structures aligned with solstices, equinoxes, or specific stars, we see evidence that timekeeping wasn't just theoretical. It was embedded into physical space, built into architecture, encoded in the environment itself. And this changes the way knowledge is preserved. Because a written record can be lost, an oral tradition can fade, but a structure aligned with the rising sun on a specific day that remains. It continues to demonstrate the knowledge, even if the explanation behind it is forgotten. In a way, it becomes a kind of silent teacher, repeating the same lesson every year, without needing words. The mainstream explanation for these alignments is that they served practical and ceremonial purposes, marking important dates, reinforcing cultural beliefs, connecting human activity to natural cycles. And again, this explanation is strong. It fits the evidence. But it also leads to an interesting observation. These alignments required precision, careful planning, an understanding of how the sun or stars move across the horizon throughout the year. And not just once, but repeatedly, because a single observation isn't enough to establish a reliable pattern. You need to confirm it, to track it over multiple cycles, to be sure that what you are seeing is consistent. So we return to the same underlying question, not whether ancient people were capable of this, they clearly were, but how they maintained that capability over time. Because knowledge is not just about discovery, it's about retention. And retention is where things often become fragile. Think about how knowledge is handled today. We assume that information, once discovered, will remain accessible, stored in books, databases, digital archives. But even now, we see how easily information can be lost. Formats become obsolete, data becomes corrupted, systems fail. Now imagine a world without those redundancies, where knowledge depends on memory, on physical records that can decay, on structures that can be damaged or destroyed. And yet, despite those limitations, certain forms of ancient knowledge appear to have persisted with remarkable consistency, which brings us to a possibility worth considering, not as a conclusion, but as a lens to examine the evidence. What if ancient knowledge systems were designed, consciously or not, with redundancy in mind? Not redundancy in the modern technological sense, but in the sense of multiple overlapping methods of preservation. Oral traditions reinforcing written records, architectural alignments reinforcing observational data, rituals reinforcing practical knowledge. In other words, the same information encoded in different forms, so that if one method failed, another could carry it forward. This doesn't require advanced technology. It requires awareness, an understanding that knowledge is fragile, and that preserving it requires more than a single pathway. And if that's the case, it might explain why certain patterns appear across different cultures, similar astronomical alignments, similar calendar corrections, similar symbolic representations of time and cycles. Not because there was a single global system, but because different societies, facing similar challenges, arrived at similar solutions, and reinforced those solutions in ways that increased their chances of survival. Still, there's a lingering detail that invites a bit more curiosity. Some ancient timekeeping systems were not just accurate. They were predictive, capable of forecasting events like eclipses with a degree of reliability that suggests a deep understanding of long-term cycles. The mainstream explanation attributes this to extended observation and mathematical pattern recognition. And again, that explanation is valid. Given enough data, patterns emerge. But predicting rare events requires more than just noticing patterns. It requires recognizing cycles that extend beyond a single human lifetime. Cycles that may take decades, even generations, to fully observe. Which brings us back, once again, to continuity. Because to track a long cycle, you either need uninterrupted observation over a very long time, or you need a system that allows knowledge to be passed forward with enough accuracy that future generations can continue the work without starting from scratch. And this is where the question becomes less about what ancient people knew and more about how knowledge itself was treated. Was it something casual, observed and used, but not deeply preserved? Or was it something more structured, something that certain individuals or groups were responsible for maintaining, refining, protecting? History gives us hints of both: priesthoods, scholars, specialized roles dedicated to observation and record-keeping, suggesting that knowledge, at least in some societies, was not evenly distributed, but concentrated, curated. And that concentration introduces another layer of complexity. Because when knowledge is held by a small group, its survival becomes tied to the survival of that group. If they are disrupted, the knowledge may not spread widely enough to be easily recovered. So when we look at ancient knowledge today, we are not just looking at what was discovered. We are looking at what survived the process of transmission. And that process is not always clean. It involves loss, distortion, reinterpretation, which means that what appears to us as a mystery may not be something that was ever mysterious to the people who originally developed it. It may simply be something that has been separated from its context. And as we continue, we'll start to explore other areas where this pattern appears. Places where knowledge seems highly refined, but the pathway that led to it is less visible, not hidden, not erased, but incomplete. And in that incompleteness, there's a quiet space for careful, grounded curiosity. As we continue, it becomes useful to shift our attention from the sky above to the ground beneath, because some of the most compelling traces of ancient knowledge are not found in texts or calendars, but in physical structures, places that still exist, still measurable, still quietly demonstrating whatever understanding went into their creation, long after the people who built them are gone. The mainstream explanation for ancient architecture is grounded and well supported. Early builders used available materials, simple tools, and a great deal of human labor. Techniques improved over time, knowledge was passed through apprenticeship, and structures became more complex as societies developed greater organizational capacity. There's nothing in this model that requires anything beyond human ingenuity and persistence. And yet, when we look closely at certain structures, not all of them, but specific examples, there is a level of precision and consistency that invites a second look, not disbelief, just a more careful examination of how these results were achieved within the constraints we understand. Take stone construction. In many ancient sites, we find massive blocks fitted together with an accuracy that leaves little room between them, sometimes so tight that even a thin blade cannot be inserted. The mainstream explanation points to techniques such as careful shaping, repeated adjustment, and the use of abrasive materials to grind surfaces into alignment. Over time, through patience and skill, these results become achievable. And importantly, experiments have shown that these methods can work. Modern reconstructions using traditional tools have demonstrated that it is possible to shape stone with a high degree of precision without advanced machinery. So again, the capability itself is not in question. But there's a difference between what is possible and what is consistently achieved across large scales. Because when we see this level of precision repeated over hundreds or thousands of stones, across entire structures, it suggests not just isolated skill, but a systematic approach, a repeatable method that produces consistent results. And that leads us to a quieter question. Not, could they do it, but how standardized were their processes? Standardization is something we often associate with more modern systems. Defined measurements, consistent tools, repeatable procedures. But in ancient contexts, standardization would have to emerge through practice, through shared knowledge, through techniques that are taught and refined until they produce reliable outcomes. So when we see consistency, we are indirectly seeing evidence of systems, even if those systems are not fully documented. Another example comes from alignment. Many ancient structures are oriented with respect to cardinal directions: north, south, east, west, or aligned with specific astronomical events, like solstices. The mainstream explanation here is again rooted in observation. By tracking the sun's movement across the horizon, or using simple tools like shadows and sightlines, it is possible to determine direction with reasonable accuracy. Over time, these methods can be refined. And once more, this is supported by experimentation. We know that basic surveying techniques can produce surprisingly precise results. But when we examine some of these alignments, the precision goes beyond what we might expect from casual observation, suggesting that the methods used were not only known, but carefully applied, perhaps repeated, cross-checked, verified. Which brings us back to a recurring theme: repetition. Precision, in almost any domain, is the result of repetition. Doing something again and again, refining it each time, reducing error, improving consistency, and over time, developing a method that works reliably. So when we see precision in ancient structures, we are also seeing the result of time, not just in the sense of how long something took to build, but how long the underlying knowledge was being developed before it was ever applied at that scale. And this introduces an interesting possibility that by the time certain monuments were constructed, the knowledge required to build them may have already been mature, refined through earlier, less visible stages. In other words, what we see as the achievement may actually be the end point of a longer process that we don't fully see. Because earlier versions, simpler structures, experimental attempts, incremental improvements, may not have survived as clearly. They may have been built with less durable materials, or simply not preserved in the same way. So the record we have is naturally biased toward the most successful examples, the ones that lasted. And that can create the impression that these achievements appeared more suddenly than they actually did. But even with that in mind, there are still details that invite further thought. For instance, in some locations, stones are not just fitted precisely, they are shaped in ways that seem to account for irregularities, as if each block was adjusted to match its neighbors, creating a kind of interlocking system. The mainstream explanation again points to skilled craftsmanship, shaping each stone individually, testing the fit, adjusting as needed, and over time, achieving a seamless result. And this is entirely plausible, but it also implies a workflow, a sequence of steps that must be followed with care, a process that likely required coordination between multiple individuals, possibly even teams, which raises a subtle question. How was that process organized? Because coordination at that level requires communication, shared understanding, perhaps even a kind of planning that extends beyond individual tasks. And when we think about large-scale construction projects involving thousands of workers over extended periods, we begin to see that the knowledge involved is not just technical, it's organizational. It's about managing resources, labor, timing, ensuring that each part of the process aligns with the others. So when we talk about ancient knowledge, we are not just talking about isolated skills. We are talking about systems, interconnected layers of understanding that allow complex tasks to be carried out reliably. And systems, by their nature, can be fragile. If one part breaks down, the whole process can be affected. Which brings us back to the idea of loss. Because if a system of knowledge is disrupted, what remains may not be the full system. It may be fragments, techniques without context, results without clear methods. And over time, those fragments can become harder to interpret. Not because they are inherently mysterious, but because the framework that made them understandable is no longer complete. This is especially relevant when we consider sites that show differences in construction techniques, where earlier layers appear different from later ones, suggesting changes in method, or even in the groups responsible for the work. The mainstream explanation here is that techniques evolved, that different periods brought different approaches. And again, this fits the evidence, but it also leaves open a quieter possibility that some techniques were lost and replaced, not necessarily improved, just different. Because progress is not always linear. Sometimes it involves trade-offs, gaining efficiency in one area while losing precision in another, adapting to new conditions, new constraints. And if that's the case, then what we see in ancient structures may not represent a single continuous line of improvement, but a more complex pattern of development, loss, adaptation, and rediscovery. And this pattern doesn't just apply to construction. It may extend to other forms of knowledge as well: mathematics, medicine, engineering, areas where ancient insights appear advanced in certain respects, but are not always carried forward in a straightforward way. Which leads us to a broader reflection, one that sits quietly beneath all of these examples. When we look at ancient knowledge, we tend to ask, how did they know this? But perhaps an equally important question is, what did they forget? Because what survives is only part of the story. And as we continue, we'll begin to explore areas where knowledge seems to bridge the physical and the conceptual, where observations of the natural world were translated into systems of thought, patterns that may reveal not just what ancient people knew, but how they understood the world around them. As we continue, it becomes useful to move away from what ancient people built and begin focusing on how they thought. Because structures, tools, and systems are ultimately expressions of something deeper: patterns of reasoning, ways of organizing information, methods of turning observation into understanding. The mainstream view of ancient thought is often framed as an early stage of intellectual development: practical, experience-based, sometimes symbolic or mythological, gradually evolving into more formal systems like mathematics, logic, and science. In this model, early knowledge is less precise, more intuitive, eventually becoming more structured over time. And in many ways, that progression is visible. We can trace the development of counting systems into formal mathematics, early herbal practices into organized medicine, observational astronomy into predictive models. There is a clear pattern of increasing abstraction, moving from direct experience toward generalized principles. But once again, there are moments where the timeline feels less smooth than expected, because when we look at certain ancient mathematical systems, for example, we find levels of abstraction that seem surprisingly advanced. Not just counting or basic measurement, but structured approaches to geometry, ratios, and numerical relationships. The mainstream explanation is that these systems developed out of necessity, measuring land, constructing buildings, managing trade, practical problems that required increasingly precise solutions. And over time, these solutions became formalized into rules and methods. And that explanation holds. But it also raises a subtle question. How did these systems become so internally consistent? Because mathematics is not just about solving problems. It's about creating systems where the rules hold true across different situations, where relationships remain stable, even when applied in new contexts. And achieving that level of consistency requires more than isolated problem solving. It requires a kind of meta-thinking, thinking about the structure of the system itself, which suggests that ancient mathematicians were not just applying knowledge, they were reflecting on it, refining it, testing its limits. And this brings us to an interesting point, the difference between discovery and formalization. It's one thing to notice that a certain method works in a specific case. It's another to recognize why it works, to generalize it, to turn it into a principle that can be applied broadly. When we see evidence of structured mathematical thinking in ancient cultures, we are seeing not just accumulated experience, but organized knowledge, systems that have been shaped and stabilized over time. And once again, this points back to continuity, because formal systems don't emerge instantly. They require iteration, correction, transmission. Which leads us to a question that sits quietly beneath all of this. How much of this intellectual development happened before it was recorded? Because written records tend to capture the later stages of a system, the point where it is stable enough to be documented. But the earlier stages, the experimentation, the gradual refinement, may not be preserved in the same way. So when we encounter an ancient text that presents a fully formed method, it can feel as though that method appeared suddenly, when in reality, it may represent the end point of a much longer process. And this pattern doesn't only apply to mathematics, it appears in early medicine as well. Ancient medical systems often show detailed knowledge of plants, treatments, and procedures. The mainstream explanation is that this knowledge developed through trial and error, observation of what worked and what didn't, accumulated over generations. And again, this makes sense. But trial and error alone doesn't always produce stable systems. It produces fragments, isolated successes and failures. For those fragments to become a coherent body of knowledge, they need to be organized, categorized, evaluated, which implies that ancient medical practitioners were doing more than experimenting. They were systematizing, creating frameworks that allowed knowledge to be stored, compared, and applied consistently. And just like with mathematics, this process requires continuity, the ability to pass knowledge forward without losing its structure. Which brings us back once again to the idea of preservation. Because systems of thought are even more fragile than physical structures. A building can survive long after its purpose is forgotten. But a system of reasoning depends on understanding, on context, on explanation. If those elements are lost, the system can become difficult to interpret, even if parts of it remain intact. And this is where things become particularly interesting, because in some cases, we find fragments of ancient knowledge that appear sophisticated, but are embedded in contexts that are harder to decode. Symbolic language, metaphors, narratives that may have served as carriers of information. The mainstream explanation is that these symbolic elements were cultural or religious, ways of expressing ideas within a particular worldview. And that is undoubtedly true. But it also raises a question. Could some of these symbolic systems have served multiple functions? not just expressing beliefs, but also encoding practical knowledge, preserving information in forms that are easier to remember, transmit, and protect. This doesn't require anything mysterious. It's something we still do today, using stories, analogies, and structured patterns to make information more memorable. But over time, if the original context is lost, those same systems can become difficult to interpret, appearing abstract or opaque. Which brings us back to a familiar pattern. What we see in ancient knowledge is not always the full system, but the parts that survived, sometimes separated from the framework that made them clear. And this separation can create the impression of mystery, not because the knowledge itself was beyond understanding, but because we are encountering it from a different angle, without the same assumptions, the same context. So as we move forward, the question becomes less about whether ancient people possessed advanced knowledge in a modern sense, and more about how knowledge was structured, preserved, and transmitted within their own frameworks. Because understanding that process may help us see not just what they knew, but how they knew it. And in that distinction, there is a deeper layer of insight, one that begins to bridge the gap between ancient and modern ways of thinking. As we continue, it becomes necessary to look at a form of ancient knowledge that sits somewhere between the practical and the conceptual. Something that doesn't always leave behind clear equations or structures, but still shows patterns of careful observation and repeated refinement. And that is early medicine. The mainstream understanding of ancient medicine is grounded in experimentation over long periods of time. People observed the effects of plants, minerals, and procedures. They learned which treatments seemed to help, which ones caused harm, and gradually built a body of knowledge based on experience. In this view, early medicine is imperfect, sometimes inaccurate, but slowly improving as observations accumulate. And there is strong evidence for this. Many ancient texts describe remedies derived from plants that we now know contain active compounds, substances that can reduce pain, fight infection, or alter physiological responses. The connection between certain herbs and their effects is not imagined. It is observable, testable. So again, the foundation is solid, knowledge emerging through observation and repetition. But as with the other areas we've explored, there are moments where the pattern becomes more interesting, not because it breaks, but because it becomes more structured than we might expect from simple trial and error alone. Because identifying that a plant has an effect is one thing, understanding how to prepare it, when to use it, how much to administer, and in what combinations, that requires a more refined system. It requires consistency, a way to compare outcomes, to recognize patterns across different cases. And when we look at some ancient medical traditions, we find evidence of exactly that. Systems where treatments are categorized, symptoms are described in detail, and methods are standardized to some degree. The mainstream explanation is that this structure developed gradually, practitioners sharing knowledge, refining methods, and eventually recording them in texts. And this explanation fits what we know about how knowledge tends to evolve. But it also introduces a deeper question. How did these systems maintain coherence over time? Because medicine is inherently variable. Different individuals respond differently, conditions change, environments shift. Maintaining a consistent body of knowledge in such a dynamic field is not simple. It requires more than just remembering what worked once. It requires filtering, deciding which observations are reliable, which are exceptions, building a framework that can adapt without losing its core structure. And that brings us back to the idea of knowledge as a system, not just a collection of facts, but an organized way of interpreting information. In some ancient traditions, we see this organization expressed through broader conceptual models, ways of understanding the body, health, and illness in terms of balance, flow, or interaction between different elements. The mainstream view is that these models are symbolic, early attempts to explain complex biological processes without the tools of modern science. And in many cases, that is likely true. They are frameworks built from observation, but expressed through the language available at the time. However, even if the underlying explanations are not scientifically accurate in a modern sense, the systems themselves can still function. They can guide observation, influence treatment decisions, and create consistency in practice. Which leads to an interesting distinction. A system does not have to be perfectly correct to be useful. It has to be internally consistent enough to produce reliable outcomes under certain conditions. And when we see ancient medical systems that persisted for long periods, sometimes across large regions, it suggests that they were achieving some level of practical reliability, enough to be maintained, taught, and trusted. But here's where the pattern becomes more complex. Because over time, as new knowledge emerges, older systems are often replaced, sometimes gradually, sometimes abruptly. And in that process, certain elements are preserved, while others are discarded. And this raises a subtle question. How do we determine which parts were truly ineffective, and which parts may have been lost due to shifts in perspective, rather than clear failure? Because history is not just a record of improvement, it is also a record of change, and change can involve loss as well as gain. For example, some ancient remedies that were once dismissed have later been revisited and found to contain useful compounds, not because the original practitioners understood the chemistry involved, but because their observations captured something real. At the same time, other treatments were clearly ineffective or even harmful, and distinguishing between the two requires careful analysis, separating observation from interpretation. And this is where our modern perspective both helps and complicates things. We have tools that allow us to test, measure, and isolate variables in ways that ancient practitioners could not. But we also approach knowledge through a different framework, one that may not always align with how earlier systems were structured. So when we look back, we are not just evaluating ancient knowledge, we are translating it, interpreting it through our own assumptions. And translation is never perfect, which means that some aspects of ancient medical knowledge may appear less coherent than they originally were, not because they lacked structure, but because we are viewing them through a different lens. And this brings us to another important idea: context. Knowledge does not exist in isolation. It is shaped by the environment, the culture, the available resources. What works in one context may not work in another, and systems that are effective within a specific setting may not translate directly across different conditions. So when we see ancient medical systems that appear sophisticated, we have to consider not just what they knew, but where and how that knowledge was applied. Because effectiveness is often tied to context, and over time, as contexts change, knowledge can become less applicable. Not because it was incorrect, but because the conditions that made it useful are no longer present. This adds another layer to the idea of loss. Because sometimes knowledge is not lost in the sense of being forgotten. It is lost in the sense of no longer being relevant, gradually fading as conditions change. And yet, fragments remain. Texts, practices, references that hint at systems we only partially understand. Which brings us back to the same quiet pattern we've been following. Ancient knowledge is not a complete picture. It is a collection of surviving pieces, some clear, some fragmented, some misunderstood. And as we move forward, we'll begin to explore areas where knowledge becomes even more abstract, where observation, symbolism, and interpretation begin to overlap, creating systems that are harder to separate into purely practical or purely conceptual categories. And in those spaces, the line between what was known and how it was expressed becomes even more subtle. As we continue, the line between practical knowledge and abstract understanding begins to blur even further, because there is a point where observation alone is no longer enough, where patterns are not just recorded, but interpreted, where the natural world is not only measured, but given meaning through systems that attempt to explain how everything connects. The mainstream explanation for this stage of ancient knowledge is that it represents an early form of philosophy, an attempt to make sense of complex systems without the benefit of modern scientific tools. People observed cycles in nature, day and night, seasons, growth and decay, and began to frame these observations within broader conceptual models, often expressed through symbolic language, narratives, or structured belief systems. And in many ways, this is exactly what we would expect. When faced with limited data but strong patterns, the human mind tends to organize those patterns into coherent frameworks, not randomly, but in ways that reflect repeated experience. But here's where things become more interesting. Some of these frameworks are not purely symbolic. They show signs of structured reasoning, internal consistency, even predictive capability within their own logic. Take the idea of balance, for example, found in multiple ancient traditions. The concept that systems, whether in nature or the human body, operate through opposing or complementary forces that must remain in equilibrium. The mainstream view is that this is a simplified way of describing complex processes, an intuitive model rather than a precise one, and that's likely true. But it's also worth noting that the idea of balance is not arbitrary. It emerges from observation. Ecosystems stabilize, bodies regulate temperature, cycles correct themselves over time. So even if the explanation is not scientifically detailed, the underlying pattern being described is real. And this raises an interesting point. Ancient systems of thought may not always aim for accuracy in the modern sense, but they often aim for coherence, creating models that are internally consistent and broadly applicable. Which means that even if the language is symbolic, the structure of the reasoning can still be quite sophisticated. And this becomes especially relevant when we look at how these systems were used. They weren't just theoretical. They influenced decision-making, agriculture, medicine, architecture, even social organization, suggesting that they were trusted as reliable guides within their context. The mainstream explanation is that these systems persisted because they were culturally reinforced, passed down through tradition, integrated into daily life. And again, this is clearly part of the picture. But there's another layer to consider: functionality. For a system to persist over long periods, it doesn't just need to be believed. It needs to work, at least well enough to justify its continued use. And this doesn't mean it has to be perfect, only that it produces outcomes that are considered acceptable or beneficial within that society. Which brings us to a subtle but important distinction between explanation and application. A system can provide a useful framework for action, even if its underlying explanation is incomplete or partially incorrect. And when we look at ancient knowledge, we often see this pattern: systems that guide behavior effectively, even if the reasoning behind them doesn't align with modern scientific understanding. But here's where things become more complex, because over time, as these systems are transmitted, the balance between explanation and application can shift. The practical aspects may remain, while the original reasoning evolves, adapts, or becomes more symbolic. And eventually, the system can appear more abstract than it originally was, less tied to direct observation, more connected to tradition, which raises a question: how much of what we interpret as purely symbolic today may have once been more directly connected to observation and practice? Because if the original context is lost, what remains can look very different from how it was initially understood. And this brings us back to the idea of knowledge transformation. Knowledge doesn't just disappear, it changes form. Practical techniques can become rituals, observations can become metaphors, systems of reasoning can become narratives. And in that transformation, the original intent can become harder to see, not because it was hidden, but because it was expressed in a way that made sense at the time, and later generations interpreted it through different frameworks. This is especially relevant when we encounter ancient texts or traditions that seem layered, containing both practical guidance and symbolic meaning, sometimes intertwined in ways that are not immediately clear. The mainstream approach is to separate these layers, to identify what is functional and what is cultural. And this is a valuable method. It allows us to isolate elements that can be tested and understood more directly. But it also has limitations, because separating layers assumes that they were originally separate, when in many cases, they may have been integrated, different aspects of the same system, working together. And if that's the case, then analyzing them in isolation may cause us to miss how they functioned as a whole, which leads to a broader reflection. Ancient knowledge systems may not fit neatly into our categories of science, philosophy, and culture. They may have operated in a more unified way, where observation, interpretation, and application were closely linked. And this doesn't make them superior or inferior, just different. Different in structure, different in purpose, different in how knowledge was organized and used. So as we continue exploring, the goal is not to judge these systems by modern standards, but to understand them on their own terms, to see how they functioned within their context, and what patterns emerge when we look at them carefully. Because in those patterns, there may be insights not just about the past, but about the nature of knowledge itself, how it forms, how it changes, and how it survives. As we continue, it becomes useful to focus on something that sits quietly at the foundation of everything we've explored so far. Something that doesn't always leave behind obvious traces, but is present in nearly every form of ancient knowledge. And that is measurement. Not just measuring in the sense of numbers or units, but the broader idea of defining consistency, creating standards, establishing ways to compare one thing to another in a reliable way. The mainstream understanding is that measurement systems developed out of necessity. Trade required consistent weights, construction required consistent lengths, agriculture required consistent timing, and over time, societies created units based on the human body, natural cycles, or standardized objects. And this explanation is solid. It reflects a natural progression from informal estimation to more precise definition. But when we look closer, we begin to notice that some ancient measurement systems achieved a level of consistency that suggests more than just convenience. They suggest deliberate calibration. Because creating a unit is one thing. Maintaining it across time and space is something else entirely. If a unit of length is based on a body part, for example, it can vary from person to person. So for that unit to remain useful, it has to be standardized, fixed in some way, replicated consistently. And that requires agreement, shared understanding, possibly even physical references that can be checked and rechecked. So when we see evidence of consistent measurements across large regions or long periods, we are not just seeing practical solutions, we are seeing systems designed to preserve accuracy. And this becomes even more interesting when we consider how these systems were maintained. Because without modern tools, maintaining precision requires repetition, comparison, correction. It requires a process. For example, in construction, If multiple workers are using the same unit of length, that unit must be communicated clearly. Tools must be made to match it. Deviations must be noticed and adjusted. Over time, this creates a feedback loop. Small errors are corrected, techniques are refined, and the system becomes more stable. And once again, we see the same pattern. Not sudden advancement, but gradual refinement. Consistency emerging through repeated application. But here's where the question becomes more subtle. Because in some cases, the precision achieved appears to exceed what we might expect from loosely maintained systems. Not in a way that defies explanation, but in a way that suggests careful attention to accuracy. Perhaps even methods of verification that are not always obvious from the surviving evidence. For instance, when structures show consistent proportions, repeated ratios, alignments that hold across different sections, it suggests that measurement was not only standardized, but applied with a high degree of discipline. And this leads to a quiet possibility that measurement systems were not just practical tools, but central elements of knowledge itself. Because once you can measure reliably, you can compare, you can detect patterns, you can refine techniques. Measurement turns observation into data, even if it's not called that. And with data, even in a basic form, you can begin to build systems that extend beyond immediate experience. So when we see advanced results in areas like construction, astronomy, or engineering, we are often seeing the outcome of underlying measurement systems that made those results possible. But here's where things become more complex. Because measurement systems, like all knowledge systems, are vulnerable to disruption. If the standard is lost, if the reference changes, if the method of verification is no longer practiced, the system can degrade. And once it degrades, reconstructing it is not always straightforward, because you may still see the results, structures, artifacts, records, but the exact method that produced them may not be fully recoverable. This brings us back to the idea of partial survival. What we have today are often the outcomes of measurement, but not always the full process behind them. And without that process, we are left to reverse engineer, to infer methods based on results, which can be effective, but also introduces uncertainty, because multiple methods can sometimes produce similar results. So when we analyze ancient measurements, we have to consider not just what was achieved, but how many different pathways could have led to that outcome. And this is where careful thinking becomes important. Avoiding the assumption that a single unexplained detail implies an extraordinary cause, while also recognizing that gaps in understanding are real. Because acknowledging a gap is not the same as filling it with speculation. It's simply recognizing that the picture is incomplete. And in that incompleteness, there is room for further exploration. Another interesting aspect of ancient measurement is how it connects different domains. Units of length relate to construction, but also to land measurement, to navigation, to even symbolic representations. Time measurement connects to agriculture, to ritual, to astronomy. Weight measurement connects to trade, to resource management, to economics. These systems are not isolated. They form networks, interconnected frameworks that allow knowledge to be applied across different areas. And this interconnectedness adds both strength and fragility. Strength because it reinforces consistency. The same unit used in multiple contexts becomes more stable. Fragility because a disruption in one area can affect others. So when we look at ancient knowledge, we are often seeing the visible parts of these networks, but not always the full structure. And this leads to a broader reflection. Knowledge is not just what is known, it is how things are connected. Measurement, in this sense, is a kind of language, a way of describing relationships in a consistent way. And like any language, it can evolve, change, or be partially lost. Which brings us to an important point. When we interpret ancient measurements, we are translating not just units, but systems of thought. And translation always involves approximation. We convert ancient units into modern ones. We map proportions onto our frameworks. But in doing so, we may miss nuances, assumptions that were implicit in the original system. So as we continue, the goal is not just to understand what ancient people measured, but how measurements shape their understanding of the world. Because in that process, we begin to see knowledge not as isolated discoveries, but as interconnected systems, built, maintained, and sometimes lost over time. And from there, we can begin to explore one of the most subtle aspects of all: how knowledge moves between cultures, how ideas travel, adapt, and transform as they pass from one context to another. As we continue, the focus naturally shifts toward movement, not of objects, but of ideas. Because once knowledge exists within a system, measured, structured, refined, the next question is how it travels, how it leaves one place and appears, sometimes in altered form, somewhere else. The mainstream explanation for the spread of ancient knowledge is relatively clear. Trade routes, migration, conquest, and cultural exchange allowed ideas to move between regions. Merchants carried not only goods, but techniques. Travelers shared observations. Empires connected distant territories under shared systems of administration and communication. And there is strong evidence for this. Similarities in writing systems, shared architectural techniques, overlapping mathematical ideas, all suggesting that knowledge did not remain isolated, but circulated. Sometimes slowly, sometimes rapidly, depending on the conditions. But when we look more closely, the pattern becomes more layered. Because knowledge does not travel as a complete package. It is rarely transferred in its full original form. Instead, it is adapted, reshaped to fit new environments, new cultures, new needs. And in that process, something subtle happens. Parts are preserved, parts are modified, and parts are lost. So when we see similar ideas appearing in different places, the question is not just, did this come from the same source? But how was it transformed along the way? For example, a measurement system might be adopted by another culture, but adjusted slightly to fit local standards. Over time, that adjustment becomes the new norm, and the original reference fades. Or a construction technique might be observed and replicated, but without full understanding of the underlying method, leading to variations, some successful, others less so. The mainstream view is that this is simply how cultural transmission works, and that's true. But it also introduces complexity when we try to trace knowledge back to its origins. Because what we are often seeing are not original forms, but evolved versions, shaped by multiple layers of interpretation. And this can create situations where similar patterns appear in different regions, not because they are identical, but because they share underlying principles that have been adapted in parallel ways, which leads to an interesting possibility that some forms of ancient knowledge spread not as detailed instructions, but as core ideas, general frameworks that could be reinterpreted depending on context. This would explain why we sometimes see structural similarities without exact duplication, systems that feel related but not identical. And it also highlights something important: the difference between copying and understanding. Copying can reproduce results, at least for a time, but understanding allows for adaptation, for refinement, for the system to continue evolving. So when knowledge moves between cultures, its long-term survival depends not just on being transmitted, but on being understood deeply enough to be maintained. And that brings us back to the idea of transformation, because as knowledge adapts, it can drift, not necessarily becoming worse or better, but becoming different. And over long periods, these differences can accumulate to the point where the original connection becomes less obvious, which makes it harder for us, looking back, to determine whether similarities are the result of shared origin, independent development, or some combination of both. The mainstream approach is to look for direct evidence, trade records, linguistic connections, archaeological links, and when those are present, they provide strong support for transmission. But in cases where the evidence is less direct, interpretation becomes more uncertain. And this is where speculation can begin, but it needs to remain grounded, because it's easy to assume that unexplained similarities imply hidden connections, when in many cases, similar conditions can lead to similar solutions independently. For example, different cultures facing the challenge of tracking time may develop similar calendar systems, not because they exchanged information, but because the underlying problem is the same. At the same time, we know that long-distance connections did exist, sometimes earlier than expected, suggesting that the movement of knowledge may have been more extensive than we can fully document. So we are left with a balanced view. Some knowledge clearly spread through contact, some likely developed independently, and some may involve combinations of both, where initial ideas were shared and then evolved separately. And this layered process can create patterns that are difficult to interpret with certainty. But it also reveals something deeper about knowledge itself. It is not static, it is dynamic, constantly changing as it moves, shaped by the people who use it. And this has an important implication. When we look at ancient knowledge today, we are not seeing a fixed system. We are seeing a snapshot, a moment in an ongoing process, a process that began long before the records we have and continued long after, which means that what appears to us as a final form may actually be a transitional one, part of a larger chain that we only partially observe. And this brings us to another subtle question. How much knowledge may have existed in forms that left little or no trace? Because not all knowledge is preserved equally. Written records survive under certain conditions. Stone structures endure over time. But other forms, oral traditions, perishable materials, practical techniques that leave no physical imprint, can disappear almost completely. And yet, those forms may have carried significant information. So when we reconstruct the past, we are working with an incomplete data set, one that is shaped by what survives rather than everything that existed. And this limitation is not a flaw. It's simply part of the process. But it does mean that our understanding is always provisional, open to revision as new evidence emerges. And as we continue, we'll begin to explore areas where knowledge becomes even harder to trace, where the boundaries between independent development and shared influence become less clear, and where patterns raise questions that don't always have simple answers, not to suggest hidden conclusions, but to better understand the complexity of how knowledge moves, evolves, and sometimes fades from view. As we continue, the focus shifts towards something even less visible than the movement of knowledge, the points where knowledge seems to pause, or even disappear entirely. Because if we follow the idea that knowledge develops, spreads, and evolves, then we also have to account for the moments where that progression becomes less clear, where systems that once appeared stable begin to fragment or fade from the record altogether. The mainstream explanation for these gaps is grounded in historical reality. Civilizations experience disruption, environmental change, conflict, economic collapse, All of these can interrupt the systems that support knowledge. Institutions break down, specialists are lost, records are destroyed, and over time, the continuity required to maintain complex systems is weakened. And there is no shortage of examples. Periods where written language declines, construction techniques become less refined, long-distance trade networks shrink, not permanently, but long enough to create noticeable gaps in the record. This model of rise, disruption, and recovery is well established, and it explains a great deal. But when we look more closely, something more nuanced begins to appear. Because these gaps are not always uniform. In some cases, certain forms of knowledge decline, while others persist, or even continue to develop, suggesting that knowledge systems are not lost all at once, but unevenly, depending on how they are structured, who maintains them, and how they are integrated into daily life. For example, highly specialized knowledge, held by a small group, dependent on specific conditions, may be more vulnerable. If the group is disrupted, the knowledge may not spread widely enough to survive intact. On the other hand, practical knowledge, embedded in routine activities, shared across a population, may persist more easily, even if it becomes less refined over time. This creates an interesting pattern, where the most advanced or specialized elements of a system may be the most fragile, while simpler, more widely distributed knowledge remains. And this can give the impression that certain capabilities were lost, not because they disappeared completely, but because the conditions required to maintain them were no longer present. Which brings us to a subtle but important idea. Loss of knowledge is not always absolute. It can be partial, a reduction in precision, a simplification of methods, a shift from structured systems to more intuitive practices. And over time, that partial loss can become more pronounced, as each generation inherits a version of the system that is slightly less complete than the one before, until eventually, what remains is recognizable, but no longer fully understood. The mainstream approach is to view these changes as part of natural historical cycles, and that's accurate. But it also raises a deeper question. How often has this process happened? Because when we look at the long span of human history, we are not seeing a single continuous line. We are seeing multiple cycles, development, disruption, recovery, repeated in different regions, at different times. And each cycle has the potential to reshape knowledge, preserving some elements, altering others, and losing certain aspects entirely. So when we encounter ancient knowledge that appears refined or advanced in specific ways, it's worth considering that we may be seeing the result of one of these cycles, a system that reached a certain level of development and then was partially lost, leaving behind traces that seem out of place when viewed without their full context. But it's important to stay grounded here, because recognizing patterns of loss does not mean assuming hidden civilizations or unknown technologies. It simply means acknowledging that knowledge depends on continuity, and continuity can be fragile. And this brings us back to something we've touched on before, the difference between results and processes. Results can survive, structures remain, artifacts persist, texts endure, but processes, the step-by-step methods, the underlying reasoning, are more difficult to preserve. If the chain of transmission is broken, the process can fade, even if the result is still visible. And this creates a situation where later generations may see what was achieved, but not fully understand how it was done, leading to reinterpretation, attempts to reconstruct methods based on incomplete information. Sometimes those reconstructions are accurate, sometimes they differ from the original approach, and over time, new systems emerge, built on partial understanding, which means that knowledge is not just lost, it is transformed through loss. And this transformation can produce interesting effects. Techniques may become more generalized, less precise, but more adaptable. Or in some cases, entirely new methods may replace older ones. Not necessarily because they are better, but because they fit the new context more effectively. And this highlights something important. Progress is not always a straight path toward greater complexity or precision. It is shaped by conditions, by what is needed, what is possible, what can be maintained. So when we look back, we should be cautious about assuming that earlier periods were always less capable, or that later periods always represent improvement in every aspect. Instead, it may be more accurate to think in terms of shifting priorities, different forms of knowledge becoming more or less prominent depending on the circumstances. And this perspective helps explain why certain ancient achievements can appear isolated, not fully connected to what came before or after. They may not be anomalies, but rather peaks within a broader landscape, moments where specific conditions allowed particular forms of knowledge to develop more fully. And when those conditions changed, the systems supporting that knowledge changed as well. Which brings us to another quiet question. How much of what we consider lost knowledge is actually knowledge that became unnecessary? Because if a system is no longer relevant to the current environment or social structure, it may not be actively preserved, not intentionally discarded, but gradually set aside. And over time, that can look like loss, even though it is really a shift in focus. This adds another layer to how we interpret the past, because absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, but it also doesn't automatically imply hidden explanations. It simply means that the record is incomplete, and working within that incompleteness requires balance, acknowledging what we know, recognizing what we don't, and resisting the urge to fill every gap with certainty. As we move forward, we'll begin to explore how these patterns of loss and transformation influence the way we interpret ancient texts and symbols, how meaning can shift over time, and how the original intent behind certain ideas can become more difficult to reconstruct. Not because it was intentionally hidden, but because time changes the way knowledge is expressed, preserved, and understood. As we continue, we move into a space where ancient knowledge becomes more difficult to interpret, not because it is necessarily more complex, but because the way it is expressed begins to shift from direct instruction and observable practice into symbols, language, and layered meaning, forms that can carry information, but also transform it over time. The mainstream explanation for ancient symbols and texts is that they served cultural, religious, and communicative purposes, a way to record ideas, preserve traditions, and convey meaning within a specific context. And this explanation is well supported. We can trace the development of writing systems, study linguistic patterns, and reconstruct portions of ancient languages with a reasonable degree of confidence. But even within this framework, there are moments where interpretation becomes less certain. Because language is not static. Meanings shift, words evolve, symbols take on new interpretations. And when enough time passes, the connection between the original intent and the surviving form can become less clear. So when we encounter ancient texts or symbolic systems, we are not just reading them, we are translating them. And that translation involves choices, assumptions about context, about meaning, about how different elements relate to one another. And while modern methods, linguistics, comparative analysis, archaeology, allow us to reconstruct a great deal, they do not always capture the full nuance of how those systems were originally understood. This is especially true when knowledge is embedded in layered forms. For example, a text might operate on multiple levels at once, conveying practical information, cultural values, and symbolic meaning simultaneously, and separating those layers is not always straightforward. The mainstream approach is to analyze each layer individually, to identify what is literal, what is metaphorical, what is contextual, and this method is effective. It provides structure, allows for testing, comparison, verification, but it also introduces a limitation, because separating layers assumes that they function independently, when in many cases, they may have been intended to work together, reinforcing each other, creating a system where meaning is distributed rather than isolated. And when that system is fragmented over time, when parts are lost, reinterpreted, or removed from their original context, what remains can feel incomplete. Not incorrect, but incomplete, which leads to a familiar pattern. We see elements that appear sophisticated, but the full framework that connects them is less visible. And this can create the impression that something is missing, not in a dramatic sense, but in a subtle one, as if we are seeing pieces of a larger structure without the full outline. This becomes particularly interesting when we consider how knowledge may have been intentionally structured for transmission, not hidden, but encoded in ways that make it easier to preserve, easier to remember, more resistant to loss. For instance, symbolic language can serve as a kind of compression, allowing complex ideas to be represented in compact forms, stories, patterns, repeated structures that carry meaning across generations. The mainstream explanation is that these forms were primarily cultural or religious, and again, that is clearly part of their function. But it's also possible that they served additional roles, helping to stabilize knowledge in environments where written records were limited or fragile. Because a story can be remembered, a pattern can be repeated, a symbol can carry multiple layers of meaning. And even if parts of that meaning shift over time, the structure itself can persist. Which means that when we look at ancient symbols today, we may be seeing both continuity and change at the same time. Elements that have remained stable, and interpretations that have evolved. And this creates a challenge. How do we distinguish between what was originally intended and what has been added, altered, or reinterpreted over time? The answer is not simple. It involves comparing sources, analyzing context, identifying patterns, and even then, certainty is not always possible. Which brings us back to the importance of perspective. When we interpret ancient knowledge, we are doing so from within our own framework, influenced by modern categories, modern assumptions. And while those tools are powerful, they are not neutral. They shape the way we see the past. So part of understanding ancient knowledge involves recognizing that difference, not trying to eliminate it, but being aware of it. Because in that awareness, we can begin to see where interpretations are strong and where they remain open. And this openness is not a weakness. It is part of the process. It allows for refinement, for new evidence to be integrated, for interpretations to evolve as our understanding improves. And as we continue, we'll begin to explore how these shifting interpretations influence modern perspectives on ancient knowledge, how certain ideas are emphasized, others overlooked, and how narratives about the past are shaped not just by evidence, but by the frameworks we use to interpret it. Because in the end, the way we understand ancient knowledge is not just about what was known, but about how we choose to see it. As we continue, it becomes important to turn the focus slightly toward ourselves, not in a personal sense, but in the way modern perspectives shape how ancient knowledge is interpreted. Because everything we've explored so far, measurement, construction, medicine, symbolism, transmission, passes through a filter, and that filter is the present. The mainstream approach to studying ancient knowledge is built on careful methodology, archaeology, linguistics, material analysis, carbon dating, comparative studies, all designed to create a structured, evidence-based understanding of the past. And this approach has been incredibly effective. It allows us to reconstruct timelines, identify patterns, and test hypotheses with a level of precision that was not possible before. But even within this structured approach, interpretation plays a central role. Because data does not explain itself, it needs to be organized, contextualized, and understood within a framework. And frameworks are shaped by assumptions. Not in a negative sense, but in the sense that every system of analysis starts with certain expectations about how knowledge develops, how societies function, how progress unfolds over time. For example, one of the most common assumptions is that knowledge generally moves from simple to complex, from less accurate to more accurate, from limited understanding to broader understanding. And in many cases, this is true. But as we've seen, the pattern is not always perfectly linear. There are moments of refinement, but also moments of simplification, periods of advancement, but also periods of disruption. So when we encounter ancient knowledge that appears highly developed in specific areas, it can challenge that expectation, not in a way that disproves it, but in a way that requires adjustment. And this is where interpretation becomes particularly important. Because when evidence doesn't fit neatly into existing models, there are different ways to respond. One approach is to expand the model, to incorporate the new information and refine our understanding. Another is to reinterpret the evidence, to fit it within the current framework, even if that requires simplifying certain aspects. And both approaches can be valid, depending on the situation, but they also shape the narrative in different ways. This is especially noticeable when we look at how certain ancient achievements are described. Sometimes they are emphasized as remarkable examples of human ingenuity, carefully analyzed, reconstructed, understood within a practical framework. Other times, similar achievements are treated more cautiously, explained in general terms, with less focus on the detailed processes involved. And this variation is not necessarily intentional. It reflects the level of available evidence, the clarity of the data, the degree of confidence in existing explanations. But it also highlights something subtle. Our understanding of the past is not fixed. It evolves. Not just as new discoveries are made, but as the frameworks we use to interpret those discoveries change. And this brings us to an important point. Uncertainty is not a flaw in the study of ancient knowledge. It is a natural part of it. Because we are working with incomplete information, fragments that have survived through complex processes of preservation and loss. And while modern methods allow us to extract a great deal of information from those fragments, they do not always provide complete answers, which means that interpretation remains open. Not infinitely open, but flexible within the boundaries of evidence. And this is where a balanced perspective becomes important, because it's easy to move too far in either direction. On one side, there is the tendency to assume that all gaps can be explained within existing models, that given enough time, every question will have a clear, conventional answer. On the other side, there is the tendency to treat gaps as indications of hidden or extraordinary explanations, to fill uncertainty with speculation that extends beyond the available evidence. But the most grounded position often lies somewhere in between, recognizing that existing models explain a great deal, while also acknowledging that they may not capture every detail, accepting that some questions remain open, not because they are unsolvable, but because the evidence is incomplete. And this perspective allows for something valuable: curiosity without conclusion. The ability to explore ideas, examine patterns, and consider possibilities. without needing to resolve everything into a final answer. Because in many ways, the study of ancient knowledge is not just about reaching conclusions. It is about understanding the process, how knowledge forms, how it changes, how it is preserved and interpreted over time. And when we approach it in that way, the gaps themselves become part of the story, not as problems to be fixed, but as areas where further insight may eventually emerge. As we move forward, we'll begin to bring these threads together, looking at how different forms of ancient knowledge, practical, conceptual, symbolic, interact, how patterns repeat across cultures, and what those patterns might suggest when viewed as a whole, not to create a single explanation, but to better understand the structure of the system itself. Because sometimes, the most interesting insights come not from individual pieces, but from how those pieces connect. As we continue, the perspective begins to widen, because up to this point, we've looked at individual domains, timekeeping, construction, medicine, measurement, symbolism, and how knowledge forms within each of them. But now, it becomes useful to step back and consider how these domains interact, how separate systems of knowledge begin to overlap, reinforce each other, and form something more unified. The mainstream understanding is that ancient knowledge developed in specialized areas that gradually became more connected over time. Early societies focused on immediate needs, food, shelter, survival, and as complexity increased, knowledge branched into more defined fields, eventually leading to structured disciplines like mathematics, astronomy, and engineering. And this progression is visible, but it can also create the impression that ancient knowledge was compartmentalized, that different areas operated independently. When we look more closely, though, a different pattern begins to emerge. Because in many ancient contexts, knowledge does not appear strictly separated. Instead, it often functions as an interconnected system, where observation in one area informs understanding in another. For example, timekeeping is not just about tracking days. It influences agriculture, which influences settlement patterns, which in turn affects construction, which relies on measurement, which connects back to mathematics. And all of these may be expressed through symbolic or cultural frameworks that help preserve and transmit the knowledge. In other words, these are not isolated systems. They are parts of a network, and networks behave differently than individual components. They can reinforce stability because information flows between nodes, but they can also amplify disruption because a breakdown in one area can affect others. This interconnectedness adds another layer to how we think about ancient knowledge, because it suggests that understanding one domain in isolation may not fully capture how it functioned in practice. A construction technique, for example, might depend on measurement systems, material knowledge, and organizational methods, all working together. So when we see a result, like a precisely built structure, we are not just seeing one form of knowledge. We are seeing the outcome of multiple systems interacting. And this brings us to a subtle but important idea. Ancient knowledge may have been less specialized, but more integrated. Not in the sense of being simpler, but in the sense of being organized differently, with fewer boundaries between domains. And this integration could have both advantages and limitations. On one hand, it allows for a more holistic understanding. Patterns observed in one area can inform another. Systems can be more adaptable. On the other hand, it can make knowledge more dependent on context, harder to separate, analyze, or transfer independently, which becomes relevant when we consider how knowledge survives over time. Because integrated systems can be more vulnerable to fragmentation. If one part is lost, the connections weaken. And without those connections, the remaining pieces can become harder to interpret. This may help explain why certain aspects of ancient knowledge appear isolated today. We are seeing fragments of a network, but not always the full set of connections that gave those fragments their original meaning. And when we try to reconstruct those connections, we are working with incomplete information, inferring relationships based on patterns that may or may not reflect the original structure. This doesn't mean reconstruction is impossible, but it does mean it requires caution and awareness of the limits of the available evidence. At the same time, there is something else that emerges from this network perspective: patterns. When different cultures, separated by distance and time, develop systems that share similar structures, not identical details, but similar relationships between domains, it raises an interesting question. Are these similarities the result of shared origins, independent development, or something more fundamental? The mainstream explanation often leans toward a combination: shared human experiences leading to similar solutions, along with instances of cultural exchange. And this is a strong explanation, but it also leaves room for further thought. Because if certain patterns appear repeatedly, across different contexts, it suggests that there may be underlying principles guiding how knowledge organizes itself, not in a deterministic way, but in a way that reflects constraints, the limits and possibilities of the natural world, the human mind, and the environments in which societies develop. For example, the need to measure leads to standardization. Standardization supports construction and trade. Trade encourages communication. Communication supports transmission of knowledge. These relationships are not unique to a single culture. They emerge wherever similar conditions exist. So when we observe patterns across ancient knowledge systems, we may be seeing both shared history and shared structure. And distinguishing between those two is not always straightforward. But perhaps the more important point is not which explanation is correct in every case, but that the patterns themselves are real, observable, worth examining carefully, because they tell us something about how knowledge behaves, how it forms networks, how it stabilizes, and how it can fragment over time. And this brings us to a broader reflection. If ancient knowledge is best understood as a network of interconnected systems, then what we have today are partial maps, reconstructions based on surviving nodes and inferred connections. And like any map, they are useful, but not complete, which means that our understanding remains open, capable of refinement as new evidence emerges, as new connections are recognized. As we continue, we'll begin to explore how this network perspective influences the way we think about continuity, whether knowledge systems can persist in hidden or subtle ways, and how traces of older frameworks might still exist within later developments, not as direct survivals, but as echoes, patterns that continue, even as the surface changes. As we continue, the idea of knowledge as a network leads us into a quieter, more subtle question. Not just how knowledge forms, connects, or even disappears, but how it might persist in ways that are not immediately obvious, not fully intact, not clearly traceable, but present in fragments, in patterns that continue even as their original structure fades. The mainstream explanation for continuity in knowledge is based on direct transmission. Texts copied, teachings passed down, methods preserved through education and practice. And where this chain remains unbroken, continuity is relatively easy to trace. We can follow ideas across generations, observe how they evolve, and identify connections with a reasonable degree of confidence. But as we've already seen, that chain is not always continuous. There are gaps, interruptions, periods where direct transmission becomes difficult to verify. And yet, even in those gaps, certain patterns seem to persist, not as complete systems, but as recurring structures, ideas that reappear in different forms, sometimes separated by time or distance, but sharing underlying similarities. The mainstream view is that these recurrences can often be explained by independent development, similar conditions leading to similar solutions. And in many cases, this is a strong explanation. If different societies face the same challenges, measuring time, organizing space, maintaining health, it makes sense that they might arrive at comparable approaches. But there is another layer to consider. Because not all patterns are purely practical. Some are structural, ways of organizing knowledge itself, frameworks that shape how information is categorized, related, and understood. And these frameworks can persist even when specific details change. For example, a system that organizes knowledge around cycles, balance, or proportion may appear in different contexts, expressed through different languages, different symbols, different applications, but still retaining a recognizable structure. The mainstream interpretation is that these are common cognitive tendencies, ways in which the human mind naturally organizes information, and this is supported by research into perception, pattern recognition, and conceptual thinking. But it also raises an interesting possibility. That continuity in knowledge may not always depend on direct transmission of content, but on the persistence of structure. In other words, even if specific ideas are lost, the frameworks that generated those ideas may remain, influencing how new knowledge is formed. And this would create a kind of indirect continuity, not a straight line from past to present, but a recurring pattern, where similar structures give rise to similar systems, even in different contexts. This is a subtle concept, and it's important to stay grounded, because it doesn't imply hidden preservation or undiscovered connections. It simply suggests that certain ways of organizing knowledge may be more stable than others, more likely to re-emerge under similar conditions. And when we look at ancient knowledge through this lens, it begins to explain why certain ideas feel familiar, even when they are separated by time or culture. Not because they are identical, but because they are built on similar underlying principles. At the same time, there are cases where continuity appears more direct, where elements of older systems can be traced into later developments, sometimes clearly, sometimes in more subtle ways. The mainstream explanation here is cultural transmission, knowledge passing through intermediate stages, adapting along the way. And this is well documented in many areas. But even in these cases, the transmission is rarely perfect. Ideas are simplified, reinterpreted, combined with other influences. And over time, the original form can become difficult to recognize, which means that continuity often exists alongside transformation. The two are not separate processes, they happen together. And this brings us back to the idea of fragments. What survives from ancient knowledge is rarely a complete system. It is pieces, elements that have persisted because they were useful, adaptable, or simply resilient. And those pieces can sometimes connect, forming partial structures that hint at a larger framework. But reconstructing that framework requires careful thought, because it's easy to overconnect, to assume relationships where there may be none, or to overlook connections that are less obvious. So the challenge is balance, recognizing patterns without forcing them, exploring possibilities without turning them into conclusions. And this approach allows for something important, a way of engaging with ancient knowledge that is both curious and grounded, not dismissing what we don't fully understand, but also not overstating what the evidence supports. Because in the end, the goal is not to solve every question, but to better understand the nature of the system, how knowledge forms, how it connects, how it persists, even in fragmented ways. And as we move toward the final parts of this exploration, we'll begin to bring these ideas together, looking at what all of these patterns, formation, transmission, loss, transformation, persistence, suggest when viewed as a whole, not as a single answer, but as a framework for thinking. Because sometimes, understanding the structure of a question is more valuable than rushing toward an answer. As we continue, everything we've explored begins to settle into a broader perspective, not a conclusion, but a kind of quiet framework, something that doesn't force answers, but allows the patterns to sit together in a way that feels coherent. Because when we look back across all of these layers, timekeeping, construction, mathematics, medicine, symbolism, transmission, loss, interpretation, we start to see that ancient knowledge is not a single thing. It is not one system or one level of advancement or one explanation waiting to be uncovered. It is a landscape shaped by human observation, necessity, creativity, limitation, and time. The mainstream view organizes this landscape into a progression, early simplicity leading to later complexity, knowledge accumulating, expanding, becoming more precise. And this framework explains a great deal. It provides structure, a timeline, a way to understand how we arrived at the present. But alongside that structure, we've seen something else: variation, moments where knowledge seems highly refined in one area and more basic in another, periods of stability followed by disruption, systems that persist, others that fade. And when we place these observations together, the picture becomes less like a straight line and more like a shifting terrain, rising in some places, flattening in others, sometimes advancing, sometimes simplifying, not random, but influenced by conditions, environment, culture, resources, continuity. And this perspective changes the way we ask questions. Instead of asking, how advanced were ancient people, which tends to compress everything into a single scale, we begin to ask more precise questions. Advanced in what way? Under what conditions? Maintained by which systems? Preserved through which methods? Because knowledge is not evenly distributed. It never has been. Even today, different fields develop at different rates. Some areas advance rapidly, others more slowly. And the same was likely true in the past. So when we encounter ancient knowledge that appears unexpectedly refined, it may not be an anomaly. It may be a reflection of focused development within a specific domain. At the same time, the patterns of loss we've explored remind us that what we see is not the full landscape. It is what remains, what survived disruption, decay, reinterpretation, and survival is selective. Certain forms of knowledge endure because they are practical, widely used, or physically embedded in structures. Others fade because they depend on fragile systems of transmission, which means that the past we reconstruct is shaped not just by what existed, but by what endured. And this introduces a quiet limitation. We are always working with partial information, not in a way that invalidates what we know, but in a way that keeps the picture open, incomplete in certain areas. And within that incompleteness, interpretation plays a role. We organize the fragments into narratives, frameworks that make sense of the available evidence. And those frameworks evolve as new discoveries are made, as perspectives shift. So our understanding of ancient knowledge is not fixed. It is a process, one that continues to change over time. And this leads to a more grounded kind of curiosity, Not the kind that looks for dramatic hidden answers, but the kind that pays attention to detail, to patterns, to the places where explanations are strong and the places where they are still developing. Because those developing areas are not failures. They are opportunities for deeper understanding. And perhaps that's one of the most important insights to take from all of this. Ancient knowledge is not something to be solved, as if there is a final answer waiting at the end. It is something to be explored, carefully, patiently, recognizing both what is known and what remains uncertain. And in that balance, there is a kind of clarity, a way of thinking that doesn't rush, that allows complexity to exist without forcing it into simple conclusions. As we move into the final part, we'll begin to bring this perspective to a close, not by resolving every question, but by reflecting on what it means to engage with knowledge in this way, how it shapes the way we see the past, and perhaps the way we understand the present. As we continue approaching the final stretch of this exploration, it becomes less about uncovering new pieces and more about understanding how all the pieces sit together, because by now, a pattern has quietly formed, not a conclusion, but a way of looking. Throughout everything we've explored, one idea has remained consistent. Ancient knowledge does not behave like a simple timeline. It behaves more like a system shaped by conditions, forming, stabilizing, adapting, and sometimes fragmenting. The mainstream model still holds its place here. Knowledge does develop, it does accumulate, and over long periods, it does tend toward greater precision and broader understanding. That pattern is real, observable, and supported by evidence. But what we've added to that picture is nuance. Because within that broader progression, there are smaller movements, variations that don't always align perfectly with the larger trend. Moments where knowledge becomes highly refined in specific areas, not universally, but in focused ways, and moments where that refinement is not fully carried forward. And when we step back, those moments don't look like contradictions. They look like natural variations within a complex system. Much like any evolving environment, growth is uneven, influenced by resources, stability, communication, and need. And this leads to a more grounded understanding of what ancient knowledge represents. Not a hidden peak of lost advancement, and not a simple baseline of early development, but a dynamic range, shaped by time, context, and continuity. What survives to us is a filtered version of that range, structures that endured, texts that were preserved, systems that remained useful long enough to be recorded or rediscovered. And around those surviving elements, there are gaps, not empty spaces filled with mystery, but areas where the record is incomplete, where processes are less visible, where connections are harder to trace. And those gaps invite questions, not dramatic ones, but careful ones. Questions about how knowledge was maintained, how it was transmitted, how it adapted when conditions changed. Because once we shift our focus from what was known to how knowledge functioned, the entire perspective changes. We begin to see knowledge as something active, something that depends on people, systems, and stability, something that requires effort to preserve. And this makes the idea of loss more understandable, not as a sudden disappearance, but as a gradual weakening of the systems that support knowledge, a disruption in transmission, a change in priorities, a breakdown in structure. And over time, that weakening can reshape what remains, reducing complexity, altering methods, sometimes preserving results without preserving the full understanding behind them. Which brings us back to one of the most subtle insights in all of this. that what appears mysterious today may not have been mysterious in its original context. It may simply be incomplete, seen from an angle where some of the connecting pieces are no longer visible, and this realization doesn't diminish the achievements of ancient societies. If anything, it highlights them, because it shows that knowledge, real, functional knowledge, was developed, maintained, and applied under conditions that were often far less stable than our own. Without the redundancy, storage, and communication systems we rely on today. And yet, despite those limitations, patterns of precision, consistency, and structure still emerged, which suggests something fundamental: that the development of knowledge is not just a product of technology, but of attention, of continuity, of the ability to observe, refine, and pass forward understanding over time. And when those elements align, even simple tools can produce complex results. As we move into the final part, the goal will not be to resolve everything, but to reflect on what this way of looking reveals, not just about ancient knowledge, but about knowledge itself, how it forms, how it survives, and how the way we choose to interpret it shapes what we see. Because in the end, the past is not just something we study, it is something we reconstruct, piece by piece, perspective by perspective. And the way we approach that process matters. As we come to the final part of this exploration, there's a natural temptation to try to bring everything to a clear conclusion, to resolve the questions, to define exactly what ancient knowledge was, how advanced it became, and what it all ultimately means. But the more carefully we've moved through this, the more it becomes clear that a fixed conclusion isn't really the point, because what we've uncovered is not a single answer, but a way of seeing, a way of approaching the past that holds two ideas at the same time: that ancient knowledge can be both grounded and incomplete, both understandable and in certain places still open to interpretation. The mainstream model remains intact. Knowledge does develop over time. It builds, refines, expands, and the systems we use today are, in many ways, the result of that long progression. But alongside that, we've seen how that progression is shaped, not just by discovery, but by continuity, by the ability to preserve, transmit, and maintain knowledge across generations. And when that continuity is interrupted, even slightly, the effects can ripple outward, altering what is retained, what is simplified, and what is eventually forgotten. So when we look back at ancient knowledge, what we are really seeing is the outcome of multiple processes layered together: discovery, refinement, preservation, disruption, reinterpretation, all interacting over long periods of time. And the result is not a perfect record, but a filtered one, a version of the past shaped by what survived. Which means that some areas appear clear and well understood, while others remain partial. Not because they are inherently unknowable, but because the chain of transmission that would make them clear is no longer fully intact. And this is where perspective becomes everything. Because how we interpret those gaps determines how we understand the past. If we assume that every gap must have a simple, conventional explanation, we may overlook areas where further insight is still possible. If we assume that every gap points to something extraordinary, we risk building conclusions that extend beyond the evidence. But if we hold a balanced view, recognizing both what is well supported and what remains uncertain, something more interesting begins to emerge. A picture of knowledge not as a straight line, but as a living system, one that grows, adapts, stabilizes, and sometimes fragments. And within that system, ancient knowledge is not separate from us. It is part of the same process. The same patterns that shaped knowledge in the past: observation, repetition, transmission, loss, are still present today. We just experience them differently, through more advanced tools, more stable systems, but the underlying dynamics remain. And this leads to a final reflection. Perhaps the most valuable thing we gain from studying ancient knowledge is not just information about the past, but insight into how knowledge itself behaves, how fragile it can be, how dependent it is on continuity, how easily context can be lost, and how that loss changes the way information is understood. Because once we see that clearly, it becomes easier to approach both the past and the present with a different kind of awareness. A recognition that what we know is always part of a larger process, one that is still unfolding, and that the gaps we encounter are not necessarily problems to be solved, but reminders of that process, places where understanding is still developing. So instead of asking for final answers, we're left with something quieter, a perspective that stays open, that examines carefully, that allows patterns to emerge without forcing them into certainty. And maybe that's the most grounded way to explore something as complex as ancient knowledge, not by trying to define it completely, but by learning how to look at it clearly and letting that clarity guide the questions that come next.